What's up, guys? So in this video, what I wanted to go ahead and talk about today was the simple fact of the matter that this is never and has never been about religion or rule of law with Christianity, and I want to show you why so many people have just kind of gotten this wrong over the course of time. And if we're not careful, that we're going to bring about the very end times that we're all, kind of anxious of at the end of the day. So I'm going to go ahead and shrink myself down here. So I want to start off by talking about the Holy Land. Why is it in this constant state of war? Obviously it was given to the Jews through the Abrahamic covenant, and it is supposed to be Jewish land. Here's the issue, though. What has happened is that you have wicked generations that rise up and basically defy God. When they defy God, what does he do? He takes the land away from them and gives it to someone who will actually steward it the way it's supposed to be stewarded. The issue, though, is when you have those wicked generations, they use all this gaslighting and manipulation. They try to use, the Torah or whatever in the Talmud to justify why they should stay in the land no matter what, when very clearly, as expressed in Deuteronomy, if Israel or the people of Israel do not follow the way that God has told them to live, then he will take it away from them. And he did it multiple times, demonstratively so in the Bible, through the different kingdoms that ruled over it technically throughout time. Here's the issue, though. When you have these wicked generations rise up who essentially disturb the peace, they use religion basically against the rest of the world. They try to say, oh, well, God wills it. Like, this is God's will, right? They try to get the novice or the new convert into believing that whatever it is they say essentially goes. So they try to emotionally manipulate through religion the people of the time. So that's why you have this tribalism that shows up where every denomination of people think that their interpretation is right or their pastor is right, and God certainly advised against it. The way that he advised against it was quite clear in I think it was in either 2 Samuel or 1 Kings, when they were starting to have the kings of people of Israel were like, hey, God, we want a king just like all these other nations. And he was like, well, no, I'm your king, and if you do get one, you're not going to like it. And so eventually God just gave over their desires of their heart. He said, okay, if this is what you want, just be prepared for the consequences. And the consequences, were corruption. Saul was the first. He seemed good at first. He was taller than everybody. He was a leader. But then his own pride and arrogance got into the way. And then God was like, okay, time to switch it up. Because ultimately God has to protect his people, right? And then this gets into, eventually, the time of Jesus. Jesus was viewed as a blasphemer. Why is this? He simply challenged the interpretation of the law. What was happening was the Pharisees and the Sadducees at the time, which were essentially, if you want to look at it this way, essentially like politicians. It was kind of like their own little government, except it was just from a more religious, authoritative lens, spiritual guidance, and they were often manipulating the Roman arm. And since he challenged their interpretation of the law, he was considered a blasphemer, because what had happened was the Jews essentially started worshiping the law instead of worshiping God, and when they did so, they were screwing over everybody else in the process, knowingly or unknowingly, because you had people who thought, oh, if I just go ahead and follow these rules, then I'm good. And then you had people who were like, oh, thank God I'm not like this person over here. And when Jesus was talking to them about it, he was like, look, it's not quite that simple. In fact, it's not even close. It's not about what you do or what you don't do. It's about your heart. Because if you seek first the kingdom of heaven, then everything else will follow. What happened was religion got used by essentially government to keep a population subdued through fear. And the thing is with God, with Yahweh, he was never a God of fear. He was a God of love, a God of choice, a God of free will. Sure, he could get jealous, just as everybody does, but the only reason he'd get jealous is because people were misunderstanding what he was having to say, and the people at the time were using it for their own selfish benefit, namely like government entities at the time. They were using it to just simply control people, and Jesus was kind of all about freedom and how you live your life, as long as you're living it in a godly manner. And this is why it's important for us to not lean on our own human logic, because human logic says, listen to the person in the church, listen to this religious leader, that religious leader, but to do so blindly. It's not encouraged for you to think for yourself, to reflect on the Bible. And that's why it was so important when Jesus came. He was using these parables for people to understand. And the Pharisees found it so offensive because it was upsetting their power structure. And quite frankly, there's nothing new under the sun. Just as it was yesterday, so it is today. People believe that if they do a certain amount of good things or whatever, that God ultimately favors them. But the irony of that line of thought is that the people closest to God, to Jesus when he was on earth, they understood just how wretched they were, how undeserving they were. And to think that there's anything that we could do personally to earn favor with God is just ridiculous and arrogant. And see, so here's what happens when you have arrogance and pride enter into the picture, where you think, oh, God wants you to do this, God wants you to do that. Then you start drawing lines, then there's senseless war, blood is shed, and ultimately it simply becomes a battle for resources. If you talk to anybody who's been overseas and you get them to actually open up to you, what you'll find is that they'll say that they felt like they were tricked. They thought that they were going over to this other nation. They thought they were fighting these bad terrorists. They thought this, they thought that. They thought they were doing a moral cause, which is how our governments deceive us to essentially go over and pillage other nations and peoples just because we can. A great example of this that kind of backfired was quite literally in the movie Kingdom of Heaven, which I've talked about before, obviously, where his name was Guy La something, and then you had Renault de Chalion or whatever. These guys were essentially bloodthirsty. Like, they just wanted to conquer and fight. They thought that the Muslims were all bad and stuff like that. And it's like, sure, is Islam a true religion? No, Islam is a deception. However, we're not supposed to just go and fight somebody because they don't worship the way that they're supposed to. What we're supposed to do is love them, have a conversation with them, try to have peace, which is why Jesus said, blessed are the peacemakers, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. We're not supposed to have peace through war and bloodshed when we basically have the other side beat into submission. That is actually very satanic in nature, I believe, because that's what Satan does to us on the regular. He will open the doors to sin. Some of us walk through, some of us deny. But largely people walk through the doors of sin, and then once you kind of get in, eventually the door is going to be shut on you, or at least it's going to feel like it's shut, and you're going to be left anxious and fearful, and you're going to think to yourself, well, shoot, like I did this, I probably deserve it. And then Satan's going to be like, yeah, you do deserve this. Like you are this bad person. Like this is your penance. When we shouldn't be thinking that way whatsoever. In fact, in the first place, we should have peace through meekness, which is restraint. It's not being weak. I know it sounds like it's just one letter off from weakness. No, meekness is strength through restraint. It's knowing that you could be violent, but you choose not to. You choose a way of peace. You choose a way of, sure, you have your one side that wants all this violence because XYZ happened. They want some kind of get back, so to speak. And then you have another leader of another side who is essentially trying to keep his people back as well. And if you have two kings that can realize that life is precious and is more important than some one-off incident, then you have peace. But instead we live in this selfish culture where we all think that we're all right over here and everybody else is wrong. They think that they're right and everybody else is wrong, and then people get together and they fight, and it's this terrible thing. And see, here's the thing. Even Jesus was against getting the Roman soldier getting his ear chopped off. Like, he was just betrayed by Judas in the Garden of Gethsemane. He was about to be taken away, soon to be crucified. And despite everything that he had to justify allowing one Roman soldier to have a chopped off ear, because surely, as humans, we could justify that with everything that was going on, right? He still chose, he said, no, he who lives by the sword shall also die by the sword. That's why peace is so important. From the very beginning, when Cain killed Abel, he said, when he approached Cain and they were talking, he was like, look, your brother's blood calls out to me from the ground of which it was spilled. God has never been like a warmongering God, only when it comes to resistance, and it's like essentially like a last resort option. In the case where two sides are essentially having a misunderstanding, that's where peacemakers need to step in and try to build a bridge, not just like all or nothing. And unfortunately, people have been deceived today, just like the zealots at the time back then, that the only way to peace is through physical domination, is through war. Nobody talks about peace through love. Peace through, like, understanding. Peace through meekness. Nobody talks about that anymore. So my question to you is, do you think war is necessary? Or do you even know why you want to think that it is in the first place? And if you do want war, which media outlet influences you the most? And when you find that media outlet that influences you, I want you to do some digging onto just how they kind of came about. I want you to try to extrapolate everything out about that company and figure out what their goals are in mind. Do they actually want peace for you? Or do they want continuous profit? Think about that, Christian. I will see you in the next one.